October 17th, 1883. The frost came before dawn, silent and absolute, painting every dead blade of grass in a thin shell of silver. It was the kind of cold that didn't whisper. It announced itself. It settled into the bones of the earth and the bones of every living thing standing on it, and it made a single, unmistakable promise. Winter was coming, and it would be merciless. Cora Whitfield felt it in her fingers first. They were wrapped around the warm teats of a Guernsey cow named Daisy, pulling milk in a slow, steady rhythm she could have performed in her sleep. The barn was small, barely more than a lean-to with a roof, and the air inside was sharp enough to sting the inside of her nose. But the cow was warm. The milk was warm. And for a few minutes in the gray half-light before sunrise, the world was still manageable. She talked to Daisy as she worked, not about anything important, about the frost, about the hay that was running low, about the way the light was starting to change in the mornings, getting thinner, weaker, as if the sun itself was losing its nerve. She had been talking to the cows for 2 years now, ever since Jesse died. He had been taken by a fever that moved faster than any prairie fire there one day, and gone the next, leaving her alone on a homestead claim, held together by raw will and 2 good milk cows. The talking wasn't madness. It was maintenance. It was the sound of a human voice in a silence so vast it could crush you if you let it. She heard the footsteps before she saw the man. They came across the frozen ground with a heavy, deliberate rhythm. No hesitation, no pause, no uncertainty in the stride. She knew it was Garrett before his shadow fell across the barn door. Her brother-in-law walked the way he did, everything with the blunt force of a man who had already made up his mind. He stood in the doorway, a figure made of hard angles and harder certainties. He was 30 years old but looked older, his face clean-shaven, his jaw set in a line that could have been carved, if from the same frozen earth beneath his boots. Behind him, half hidden in his shadow, stood his new wife. Delia was 22, pale with the careful stillness of a woman who had learned that invisibility was a form of safety. She did not speak. She rarely did in Garrett's presence. Garrett did not ask to come in. He did not offer a word of comfort about the coming season. He did not inquire about her health or the cows or the state of the roof that had been leaking since September. He simply stated the fact of the matter as he saw it, delivering it like a man reading a deed aloud in a courtroom. "It's the way of things, Cora," he said, his breath pluming white in the frigid air. "A woman alone can't hold this claim. Delia and I will need the cabin. It's settled." Cora's hands did not stop moving on Daisy's teats. The milk continued its quiet percussion against the side of the pail. She had known this moment was coming. She had felt it building for months, the way you feel a storm building on the horizon, a slow darkening of the air, a shift in pressure that presses against your chest before the first drop of rain ever falls. Garrett had been circling the claim since the day Jesse was buried, a patient vulture, waiting for the appropriate interval of grief to expire. But knowing a blow is coming does not make it land any softer. "You have papers," she said. It was not a question. Garrett reached into his coat and produced a folded letter. She could see the wax seal even from where she sat, a smudge of dark red against the cream-colored paper. He held it out to her. She dried her hands on her apron, stood and took it. The letter was from Judge Leland Moss, the county magistrate. The language was formal, stiff, and final. It stated that according to the provisions of the territorial law, the property rights to the original Whitfield homestead claim, filed under the name of the deceased Jesse Whitfield, would transfer to his nearest male relative. The nearest male relative was, of course, Garrett. Cora read it once. She read it again. Her hands trembled, a fine vibration that traveled from her fingertips to her wrists, but her face did not change. She folded the letter along its original creases and handed it back. "You planned this," she said. "I did what was necessary." For a moment, a single suspended moment, Cora looked past Garrett at Delia. The younger woman's eyes were wide, and in them Cora saw something unexpected. It was not hostility or triumph. It was a mute, desperate apology. Delia opened her mouth, her lips parting as if to form a word, perhaps a protest, perhaps a simple, "I'm sorry." But Garrett shifted his weight, a subtle movement barely perceptible, and Delia's mouth closed. The word, whatever it was, died unspoken. She looked down at the ground. Two women, one about to lose everything, and one who had a roof but no voice. In that brief exchange of glances, something passed between them that neither could have articulated, a recognition of a shared condition, a shared cage with different bars. Cora turned back to Garrett. "The cows come with me," she said. There was no tremor in her voice now. It was flat, certain a statement of fact to match his own. Garrett hesitated. It was a small hesitation, barely a flicker, but Cora saw it. He had expected tears. He had expected pleading. He had prepared himself for a fight that involved weakness, and instead he was facing something harder than that, a quiet, immovable refusal to break. "Take them," he said, recovering quickly. "They'll not survive the winter without a proper barn anyway." He paused and then added with a cruelty so casual it could only have been premeditated, "Come spring, I expect I'll be buying their carcasses back from the wolves." The words landed. Cora felt them, a cold blade sliding between her ribs, but she did not flinch. She held his gaze until he was the one who looked away. She took stock of her life in the minutes that followed, and the inventory was brutal in its simplicity. Two Guernsey cow, Daisy and her older companion Buttercup, who shifted her weight nervously in the stall, her brown eyes liquid and watchful, a spade with a cracked handle, a woodsman's axe, its head freshly sharpened, one heavy cast iron pot, a single wool blanket patched at the corners with thread she had pulled from a flour sack, the clothes on her back, the worn leather boots on her feet, and $20 folded into a small, tight square in her pocket, the sum total of what Garrett had calculated as her share of 2 years of labor, 2 years of keeping this claim alive after his brother died. It was an insult, but arguing was a luxury she could no longer afford. There was no court in the territory that would side with a 20-year-old widow against a man with a new bride and a firm grip on the law. She led the cows out of the barn. Daisy came willingly, her head low, trusting. Buttercup followed slower, her breath misting around her nostrils in the cold. Cora did not look back at the cabin where she had cooked Jesse's meals, where she had held his hand as the fever took him, where she had lain awake in the months after listening to the wind and learning the precise sound of loneliness. She did not look back because looking back was an invitation, and the guest it summoned was despair, and despair was a weight that could kill you faster than any cold. Instead, she looked west, toward the low-rolling horizon, toward a piece of unclaimed land miles from town, a place Jesse had pointed out to her once on a long walk in the early months of their marriage. Back when the future was a wide-open country they planned to cross together. The walk took the rest of the morning and most of the afternoon. The sun moved across the sky in a low, tired arc, bleeding yellow light across the vast, empty prairie. Cora walked without stopping, the lead ropes in one hand, the spade balanced across her shoulders with the other. The cows plodded behind her, patient and uncomplaining, their hooves crunching on the frost-hardened grass. As she walked, a memory surfaced, vivid and uninvited. Jesse kneeling on this same stretch of prairie, kicking at the dirt with the toe of his boot. It had been a warm day early in their first autumn, and they had walked further from the cabin than they ever had before exploring the land that stretched in every direction like an ocean made of grass. He had found the hill, a prominent swell of earth maybe 40 feet high, with a sheer, sun-baked southern face. The grass on it was sparse and reluctant. Jesse had crouched down and picked up a handful of the soil, turning it over in his fingers. It wasn't the loose, dark loam of the river bottoms. It was something else entirely. Dense, pale, heavy. "Ground here holds its shape," he had said, squeezing the handful into a solid lump. "Like it remembers what it's supposed to be." It had been a passing comment, an observation made between one footstep and the next, forgotten almost as soon as it was spoken. He could not have known that one day those words would become the only map his wife had left. She reached the hill as the afternoon light began to fail. It was exactly as she remembered, a broad, bald swell of earth rising from the prairie floor, its southern face steep and exposed, baked hard by years of unobstructed sun. The soil was not ordinary dirt. It was a dense, pale clay mixed with compacted silt sediment deposited by ancient winds during the last ice age, packed tight over millennia into a material that was almost like soft stone. It was poor land for farming, too heavy for a plow, too dense for roots. That was why it remained unclaimed. No one wanted it. But Cora was not looking for a place to plow. She was looking for a place to survive. She tied the cows to a stunted, hardy bush at the base of the hill. She walked to the southern face and struck the earth with her spade. The sound was a dull thud, not the crisp slice of good soil. Harder, denser. She struck again, putting the full weight of her small frame behind the tool. A wedge of dirt the size of a loaf of bread came loose. She picked it up. It didn't crumble. It held its form solid and heavy in her palm, just as Jessie had said it would. A plan began to form in her mind. It was not a plan born of cleverness or education or any particular genius. It was born of the only force strong enough to overcome the impossible. Necessity. She had no money for lumber. She had no time to build a cabin before the first true snows came to bury the world. She would use what the land gave her. The hill would be her lumber. The earth itself would be her walls. She marked out a rectangle on the face of the hill, pacing it carefully. 16 feet wide, 12 feet deep. It seemed impossibly large a grave for a giant. She took off her worn coat, folded it, laid it on the ground, and began to dig. The first hour was a battle. The sun-hardened crust resisted every stroke, sending shocks up through the wooden handle that rattled her teeth. Her palms, toughened by 2 years of milking and mending, but not prepared for this, began to blister within minutes. The skin split and wept, and every grip on the handle was a small negotiation with pain. But beneath that first foot of baked surface, the soil changed. It became cooler, slightly damp, more yielding, still heavy, still dense, but it came away in satisfying solid chunks that held their shape when she tossed them aside. Each shovelful was a small, wordless victory. She fell into a rhythm. Drive the spade, lift the weight, turn, toss, drive, lift, turn, toss. She did not think about Garrett or his cruelty. She did not think about the cabin or the life she had been forced to leave behind. She thought only about the next shovel, and the next, and the next. The rhythm became a kind of prayer, each repetition a quiet argument against the cold certainty of Garrett's prediction. The sun set. She kept digging by the light of a rising moon. Her muscles screamed a fiery protest that spread from her shoulders to her lower back, to her calves, a full-body rebellion against the work she was asking of it. She stopped only to drink from her canteen and to check on the cows, murmuring to them in the darkness, her voice raw from the cold air. Just a little longer, she told them. I'll make us a place. By the time the moon was high, she had carved a shallow depression into the hillside no more than 2 feet deep and roughly the width of her body. It was not a shelter. It was barely a scratch on the surface of the earth. But it was a beginning. She huddled in the depression that night, pulling the wool blanket over herself and pressing her back against the cold, solid wall of dirt she had exposed. Above her, the sky was a black vault punctured by a million indifferent stars. The wind moved across the prairie in long, low waves, and the temperature continued to drop, tightening its grip on the land like a closing fist. Sometime in the small hours, she woke. The cold had gone past discomfort into something more absolute. Her body shook, uncontrollably violent tremors that rattled her jaw and made her teeth click together. The darkness was total. There was no light anywhere. Not a lantern, not a window, not a single sign of human habitation in any direction. She was alone on the surface of the earth, as alone as any person had ever been. And for the first time since she had walked away from the cabin that morning, Cora Whitfield cried, not from anger, not from determination or defiance or any of the harder emotions she had used as armor throughout the day. She cried from loneliness, pure, distilled, bottomless loneliness. The kind that comes from the sudden understanding that if she died right here tonight in this shallow scrape of dirt on the side of an unnamed hill, no one would come looking. No one would notice. The world would continue to turn. The sun would rise on a landscape that did not include her, and the grass would grow over the place where she had lain, and that would be the end of the story of Cora Whitfield. The tears came hot and fast and then froze on her cheeks, thin trails of salt that tightened her skin. She pressed her face into the rough wool of the blanket and let the grief have its way. It was not a grief for Jesse alone, though he was in it. It was a grief for the entire architecture of the life she had been promised, a life that had been dismantled piece by piece until there was nothing left but this, a hole in the ground, and a blanket in the vast, uncaring dark. She did not know how long she lay there. Minutes, perhaps an hour. The shaking did not stop, the cold did not relent. But then from somewhere in the darkness, a sound, low, warm, familiar. A soft lowing, a question posed in the only language Daisy knew. The cow had shifted closer in the night, drawn by some animal instinct toward the only other living warmth in the landscape, and her breath, moist and grassy, reached Cora's face like a benediction. Cora crawled toward the sound. She found Daisy's flank in the dark, warm and solid, and impossibly alive. And she pressed her back against it, pulling the blanket around both of them as best she could. The cow's body heat seeped into her bones, slow and steady, pushing back against the killing cold. "Still the two of us," she whispered. And that was the bottom. That was the lowest point the story would reach. Not because things wouldn't get harder, because they would many times over. But because in that moment, with her back against a key and her face wet with frozen tears, Cora Whitfield made a choice. Not a grand heroic choice. Not a conscious decision fueled by courage or conviction. Something smaller and more stubborn than that. Daisy needed to be milked in the morning, and there was no one else to do it. So she had to be alive in the morning. And if she had to be alive in the morning, she had to survive the night. And if she had to survive the night, she could not afford to lie here and grieve. She closed her eyes. She matched her breathing to the slow, steady rhythm of the cow's heartbeat against her spine. And she slept. A month of relentless labor bled into the gray stillness of November. The shallow depression became a cavern, a gaping, dark mouth in the side of the hill. Cora had moved over 300 cubic feet of earth, one shovelful at a time. Her body had transformed. The soft lines of her youth had been planed down into taut muscle and sinew. Her hands were calloused and permanently stained with the pale soil of the hill, the creases in her palms mapped in white like the dry beds of ancient rivers. She had devised a system, an economy of motion born from exhaustion and refined by repetition. 2 hours of digging, carving away at the interior. Then 1 hour of hauling the dirt out using a sling she had fashioned from a spare hide, dragging the heavy loads up the ramp she had graded into a gentle slope leading down into the earth. Inside, the air was still and cool, smelling of damp clay and deep stone. The space was large enough now for a person to stand upright in the center. She had left a thick pillar of undisturbed earth in the middle of the room to support the ceiling, a technique she had observed in the timbered mines she had seen as a child. It was crude engineering, but it held. The riders from Prospect Creek began appearing on the ridge in the second week. They would sit on their horses, small dark figures against the enormous sky, and watch her work for a time before turning and riding away. She heard the whispers when she made her weekly trip to the creek for water. She felt their eyes on her back as she passed the saloon. The quiet, knowing laughter. They had names for her. The Hill Witch, the Ground Scraper. They saw a lone woman digging a hole in the ground and drew the only conclusion that made sense to them. She was mad. The judgment was a cold weight she carried alongside the buckets of earth, another burden for a back that was already bending under the load. One afternoon at the creek, she encountered a woman she had seen before but never spoken to. Nettie Sutter was 32, the wife of a farmer and a friend of Garrett's, a woman whose face held the particular kind of tiredness that comes not from physical labor, but from the daily practice of making yourself smaller. Nettie was filling her own water pail when she looked up and saw Cora's hands, the blisters, the cracked skin, the dirt ground so deep into the lines that it looked like it had always been there. Nettie reached into her apron and produced a small bundle wrapped in a handkerchief. Bread. She held it out toward Cora, a furtive, hurried gesture, her eyes darting toward the path. But her husband was there. He had come up behind them, a thick-necked man with a proprietary grip on everything within his reach. "Leave her be," he barked loud enough for anyone at the creek to hear. "Garrett says she's lost her mind. Don't get mixed up in it." Nettie flinched. Her hand retreated. The bread disappeared back into her apron. Cora looked at the man, then she looked at Nettie, and in Nettie's eyes she saw the apology that the woman could not speak aloud, and behind the apology something else. Envy. Not for Cora's suffering, but for her freedom to suffer on her own terms. "Thank you," Cora said quietly to Nettie. Then she picked up her water pail and walked away. She did not take the bread, not out of pride, because she knew that if she accepted it, Nettie would pay the price when she got home. 3 days later, Silas Crail rode out to the hill. He was the owner of the general store in Prospect Creek, a quiet man of 58 with kind eyes set deep in a face mapped by decades of prairie wind. He dismounted and walked to the edge of the excavation, peering into the growing darkness of the interior. He stood there for a long time, his hands in his coat pockets, saying nothing. "That's a fair bit of work for one person," he finally said, his voice like gravel dragged over wood. "Has to be done," Cora replied, not stopping. He watched the rhythmic scrape and thud of her spade. Then he reached into his saddlebag and took out a small cloth sack. Dried beans. He held it out. "Got more than I need. I'll trade you for a quart of milk a week come spring, if the cow's still giving." It was an act of quiet faith, a wager placed on her survival. He was seeing a barn where everyone else saw a grave. Cora stopped digging. She wiped the sweat from her brow at the back of a filthy hand and took the beans. "You'll have your milk, Mr. Crail." He nodded. Then he paused, one foot already in the stirrup, and looked back at her. "Cora, there's something you should know." His voice dropped. "Garrett's been talking to Judge Moss, telling him you abandoned your old claim and never registered a new one. Under the Homestead Act, you've got 6 months to prove continuous improvement on this land. If you can't show that he can petition to have your right revoked." He pulled himself onto his horse. "Keep digging and save every receipt for every tool you buy." He rode away without another word. The sack of beans felt heavier than any stone she had lifted, but the information he had given her was heavier still. She had 6 months. The clock was running, and winter did not wait. The dread sharpened her focus. She worked longer hours, pushing deeper into the hill, knowing now that every cubic foot of earth she removed was not just shelter, but evidence. Proof that she was here. Proof that she was building. She was in her makeshift lean-to-one evening, wrapped in the wool blanket against the increasingly bitter nights, when she heard hooves. Not one horse. Several. They came fast from the direction of town, and the riders were loud, their voices carrying across the empty landscape in the way that only drunk men's voices carry, with a recklessness that mistakes volume for courage. 3 of them. Young men ranch hands, probably full of whiskey, and the particular cruelty that bored young men inflict on those they consider beneath their notice. They galloped past the hill, whooping, and one of them hurled a stone that struck the unfinished section of the roof with a sharp crack. "Evening Hill Witch," one of them shouted. "Digging your own grave out here." Another stone. This one landed closer, not 2 feet from where Cora lay. Daisy bellowed in fear, straining against her tether. Cora did not move. She lay in the dark, one hand on Daisy's rope to keep the cow from bolting, the other wrapped around the handle of her axe. She did not go outside, not because she was afraid, because she was a 20-year-old woman alone on the open prairie at night, and 3 drunk men on horseback was a mathematics problem with only one solution, and that solution was stillness, silence, and survival. They circled the hill twice more, threw a few more stones, laughed a few more laughs, and then, their entertainment exhausted, rode back toward the lights of Prospect Creek. In the morning, Cora found the rocks they had thrown. She picked them up one by one and carried them into the dugout. She set them against the base of the wall where they fit neatly into the curve of the earth. Then she went back to her spade. The first true blizzard arrived on the 3rd of December. It came not with the gentle warning of flurries, not with the slow accumulation of gray clouds, but as a sudden, violent ambush. The sky turned a bruised metallic color, and the temperature dropped 20 degrees in a single hour. Then the wind rose, and with it came a blinding horizontal wall of snow that erased the world. Cora had been working on the roof a desperate race against time. Her design was simple, a lattice of scavenged cottonwood branches laid across the top of the excavation, covered with thick layers of prairie sod she had painstakingly cut and hauled from the surrounding grassland. It was only half finished. A gaping hole remained over the back portion of the shelter, an open invitation to the storm. She scrambled to get the cows inside down the ramp into the relative quiet of the dugout. The wind at the entrance was a physical force, a pressure that pushed back against her body and tried to steal the air from her lungs. Daisy, younger and healthier, was frightened but compliant. Buttercup was another matter. The older cow had been sick for a week, a deep, rattling cough that Cora listened to each night with growing dread. The sudden, brutal cold hit the animal like a blow. By nightfall, Buttercup was down lying on her side on the dirt floor, her breathing shallow and ragged. Snow poured through the unfinished roof, piling in pristine, deadly drifts in the corner. The temperature inside the shelter plummeted. Cora worked with a focused, frantic energy. She draped her own wool blanket over the sick cow. She piled straw around the animal, trying to insulate her from the frozen ground. She hung a spare hide over the entrance to block the wind, plunging the interior into a total darkness, broken only by the sputtering flame of her single tallow lamp. For 2 days and 2 nights, the blizzard raged, and Cora did not sleep. She alternated between 2 tasks with the mechanical persistence of a clock. First, she would kneel beside Buttercup, rubbing the cow's limbs to keep the blood circulating, murmuring into the animal's ear, her own breath freezing in the air between them. Then she would climb out into the maelstrom, fighting through waist-deep snow to cut more sod, her axe ringing against the frozen earth with a dull, dead sound. She would drag the heavy squares back to the dugout, her body bent almost double against the wind, and heave them onto the roof frame, closing the gap inch by agonizing inch. On the morning of the 3rd day, the wind stopped. The silence that followed was profound and absolute, a muffled stillness that pressed against the ears. The sun rose on a world transformed. The prairie lay buried under 4 feet of immaculate snow, every contour softened, every landmark erased, as if the land itself had been wiped clean and started over. Inside the dugout, the roof was sealed. The air was warmer now, still and enclosed. But it was too late. Buttercup was gone. Cora placed her hand on the cow's flank. The great rib cage was motionless. The warmth had left the body sometime in the night, replaced by a cold that was deep and final and unyielding. She had failed. She had fought the storm for 2 days and 2 nights, and the storm had won. Grief came. It was sharp and sudden, and it closed her throat like a hand. She pressed her forehead against Buttercup's still neck and felt the tears come again, hot against her frozen skin. This animal was not just livestock. She was half of Cora's inheritance, half of the life she and Jesse had planned, a gentle creature with brown eyes and warm breath, who had trusted her and whom she had not been able to save. But the wilderness does not permit the luxury of prolonged sorrow. There is always the next task, the next necessity, the next cold morning that demands action, regardless of what the heart is feeling. Cora straightened. She wiped her face. She looked at the dead animal with eyes that were red but dry. Buttercup was gone, but her body was a resource, and in this place at this time, resources could not be wasted. With tears still drying on her cheeks, Cora took out her sharpest knife. In the dim, cold silence of her earthen shelter, surrounded by a world erased by snow, she began the grim, precise, necessary work of butchering the cow she had tried so desperately to save. Every methodical cut was an act of defiance against the winter that had claimed the animal. She did not think about grief. She thought about how many pounds of meat she could salt, how many weeks it would last, whether Daisy's milk would hold through the lean months. Outside, under 4 feet of snow, the world had forgotten her. But inside the hill, despite the sealed door, despite the absence of fire, the air held at a temperature that, while cold was not lethal, the earth around her was not freezing. It was holding steady breathing out a faint residual warmth that she could feel against her back when she leaned against the wall. The hill was keeping her alive. She did not understand why. She did not know the science, the principle, the name for what the earth was doing, but she felt it, and she would not forget. Spring came late that year, not as a relief, but as a slow, grudging negotiation between the frozen earth and a sun that seemed unsure of its own authority. The snow retreated in stages, leaving behind a landscape that looked like something chewed up and discarded, brown and sodden, and scarred the bones of the prairie, showing through its torn skin. Creek beds ran high with meltwater, the color of weak coffee. The wind carried a different smell now, not the metallic bite of deep winter, but something raw, the scent of thawing mud and last year's dead grass finally being allowed to rot. Inside the hill, Cora Whitfield had not merely survived. She had by some calculus that the people of Prospect Creek could not yet comprehend prospered. The salted meat from Buttercup stored in the coldest recess of the dugout had carried her through January and February and the worst of March. Daisy, her remaining cow, had weathered the winter in the dry, stable warmth of the sealed shelter and emerged into spring pet glossy and giving milk so rich it left a yellow film on the rim of the pail. The bull calf she would buy with the money she was about to earn was still a month away, still an abstraction, a future tethered to the stack of coins waiting for her at Silas Crail's counter. But first she had to get there. In April, Cora loaded a pack with salted beef and several small cloth-wrapped wheels of hard cheese she had taught herself to make during the long, silent weeks underground. She had learned by trial and failure, the first 3 batches going to mold or drying into inedible bricks, before she discovered that wrapping the curd tightly in muslin and pressing it under a flat stone for 3 days produced something dense, sharp, and surprisingly good. She walked the 10 miles to Prospect Creek with the pack on her back and Daisy on a lead rope, and she walked without stopping. The town looked different in spring, smaller, more fragile. Several homesteads on the outskirts showed visible damage from the winter roofs, sagging fences, collapsed under the weight of months of snow. The people she passed looked thinner, their faces carrying the particular hollowness that comes from a season of too little food and too much cold. They stared at her, not with the old mockery, the sly grins and whispered jokes about the hill witch. This was something else. She was supposed to be dead. She was supposed to have been found frozen in her hole when the thaw came, curled up like a field mouse that had made the fatal miscalculation of believing a burrow could defeat a blizzard. Instead, here she was walking into town with a pack full of provisions and a cow that looked healthier than anything in any barn for 20 miles. The stairs followed her all the way to Silas's store. She placed her goods on the counter without ceremony. "Your milk starts next week," she said, "and I have this to sell." Silas unwrapped a piece of the beef, sniffed it, pressed it with his thumb. He sliced a thin wedge from one of the cheese wheels and placed it on his tongue, chewing slowly, his expression unreadable. Then he opened his ledger, did his figuring with a stub of pencil, and pushed a small stack of coins across the worn wood. "Winter was hard on many," he said, by way of explanation for the generous price. "Carsons lost half their herd. Old Fitzwilliam lost every chicken he owned." He paused. "Harlan Briggs buried 6 calves in 1 week." Cora swept the coins into her palm. It was more money than she had held at one time in her entire life. She did not buy lace or ribbon or any of the small comforts that might have softened the edges of her existence. She bought a second-hand plowshare, a bag of seed corn, and after a long, stubborn negotiation with a rancher whose stock had been gutted by the freeze, a young bull calf with knobby knees and a confused expression. As she was leaving, Silas called after her from the doorway. His voice was low, meant for her ears only. "Cora, one more thing. There's a man been drifting through the area. Name of Virgil Peck. Makes his living jumping claims on land folks have abandoned or can't defend. Been run out of 2 towns already." He let the words settle. "Watch yourself." She nodded, filed the name away, and began the slow walk home with the calf stumbling along behind her. The name Virgil Peck sat in her mind like a pebble in a boot, small but impossible to ignore. The long days of May and June were a second act of construction, different from the desperate excavation of autumn. This was building with purpose rather than panic. Cora used the plowshare not to break sod for planting, but to loosen the compacted earth inside the hill, carving out a new chamber adjacent to the first, a dedicated space for the livestock separate from her own small living quarters. She engineered a drainage channel along the floor, angling it toward the entrance so that rainwater and snowmelt would flow out rather than pool inside. She hauled flat, smooth stones from the creek bed one at a time in a canvas sling across her back and laid them into a floor that was level and dry and cool beneath her bare feet. It was exhausting work, but it was different from the frantic digging of October. There was satisfaction in it now. Each improvement was not a defense against death, but an investment in a life she was beginning to believe might actually continue. The heat arrived in July, and by August it had become a living thing, a weight that pressed down on the prairie and squeezed the moisture from everything it touched. The grass turned pale and brittle, crackling underfoot like old paper. The air above the ground shimmered and warped, bending the horizon into liquid shapes that promised water and delivered only more heat. In every cabin and sod house in the territory, milk soured by noon. Butter melted into yellow puddles, meat spoiled between morning and evening. But inside the hill, the air was cool. Cor noticed it gradually, the way you notice a sound that has been present all along, but only becomes audible when everything else goes quiet. She would step from the blinding white heat of the August prairie into the entrance of the dugout and feel the temperature drop across her skin like stepping into a creek. The deeper she went, the cooler it became, until in the main chamber, the air sat at a steady, mild temperature that never changed, never wavered, regardless of what the sun was doing above. She sat on her stool one afternoon, her hand pressed flat against the earth wall, and felt it. The wall was cool, not cold, not damp, just cool. The way creek water is cool on a hot day, a gentle, persistent refusal to participate in the violence of the surface temperature. The hill was absorbing the brutal heat of the day and the chill of the night and returning neither. It was a massive, patient regulator, a flywheel of earth and stone that smoothed out the wild extremes of the prairie climate into something livable, something constant. This understanding changed everything. If the main chamber was cool, then a deeper chamber would be colder. Cora began to excavate a smaller room at the very back of the cavern, pushing further into the heart of the hill. This work was different again. Slower, more difficult. The earth here was more compacted, and she encountered layers of shale that had to be chipped away with the pickaxe she bought from Silas, each stroke sending sparks and a ringing vibration up through her arms. She lined the new room with the flat creek stones, fitting them together with the care of a mason, sealing the entrance with a heavy door made of packed sod over a wooden frame. When she placed a thermometer inside the finished cellar and left it for a day, the reading held at a steady 42 degrees. A perfect natural cold room requiring no ice, no machinery, no maintenance. She could now make butter in the dead of summer and it would hold its shape. She could age her cheeses for months, the cool air developing flavors that were sharper and more complex than anything she had produced before. She was no longer merely surviving. She was becoming something else. A producer, a craftswoman. The hill was not just her home and her barn, it was her greatest tool. The word spread through Prospect Creek in the way that all information traveled across the prairie, slowly carried by riders, and repeated at general stores and church socials, gaining detail and distortion with each retelling. The woman in the hill had butter in August, cold butter, firm, pale, cool to the touch at high noon. People began to ride out not to mock or gawk, but to see for themselves. They would buy a pound of her butter or a wedge of her cheese and ask casually if they could have a look inside. Cora obliged. She had no reason not to. They would step from the 100-degree furnace of the afternoon into the calm, dim interior and fall silent. Every one of them. The same reaction. A brief involuntary widening of the eyes, a slackening of the jaw, and then a long, slow exhalation, as if they had been holding their breath for weeks and only now realized they could let it go. One day in early September, Harlan Briggs rode out. He was the largest cattle rancher in the district, A big man with big opinions and the financial weight to make those opinions stick. He had been openly scornful of Cora's project from the beginning, referring to it in the saloon as that girl's badger hole. He remained on his horse looking down at her with the particular condescension of a man who has never been proven wrong about anything that mattered to him. Heard you got a calf, he said. Figured I'd see the place that didn't kill your stock. Cora did not argue or explain or defend. She simply gestured toward the entrance. See for yourself. Briggs dismounted. He had to stoop to enter, which did not improve his mood, and he disappeared into the cool darkness of the dugout for what felt like a very long time. When he emerged blinking in the harsh light, something in his face had shifted. The condescension was still there, but it was cracked now, fissured by something he had not expected to feel. It's dry, he said, and clean. Warmer than a drafty barn in winter, I'd wager. He squinted at her, then at the hill, trying to reconcile what he had experienced with what he had believed. My wife's been wanting fresh milk. I'll buy a gallon. He paid fair price without haggling. As he rode away, he looked back once. It was the look of a man who has just learned that the world contains more than he had accounted for. 2 weeks after Briggs's visit, Cora returned from the creek with her water pails to find a man sitting on a rock near the entrance to the dugout. He was lean and still, with the patient, watchful posture of someone accustomed to waiting. His clothes were worn but not ragged, and his eyes moved over the landscape with a quick, assessing intelligence that set him apart from the ranchers and farmers she was used to. He introduced himself as Virgil Peck. Saw the place from the ridge, he said, smiling. Impressive bit of work. Thought I'd come say hello. He accepted the cup of water she offered and drank it slowly, his eyes moving over the interior of the dugout in a sweep that was too thorough, too calculated to be casual. He asked questions that sounded friendly, but landed like probes. Was she out here alone? Did she have the deed filed? It was a long way from town, wasn't it? Cora answered carefully, giving away nothing, revealing nothing. But she felt it a shift in the air between them that had nothing to do with temperature. It was the feeling of being assessed, measured, cataloged. The feeling of a predator taking the dimensions of its prey. Virgil left with a tip of his hat and a promise to stop by again sometime. Cora watched him ride away and stood in the entrance for a long time after he had disappeared, her arms crossed, her jaw set. 3 days later, she entered the dugout at dawn to begin her morning chores and stopped dead. The central pillar, the thick column of undisturbed earth she had left to support the ceiling, the structural heart of her entire construction, had a hunting knife buried in it. The blade was sunk 3 inches deep, driven with force and precision into the packed clay. There was no other sign of intrusion. Nothing stolen, nothing disturbed. Just the knife planted like a flag, a message that required no words. I was here. I was inside your home while you slept, and there is nothing you can do about it. Cora pulled the knife free. She held it in her hand, feeling its weight, the worn leather of the grip, the quality of the steel. It was a good knife, the knife of a man who knew how to use it. She rode to Silas's store that afternoon and placed the knife on the counter. Silas looked at it. His face tightened. Virgil Peck, he said, he's making his play. That knife is his calling card. He does this, finds a claim he wants, intimidates the holder into leaving, then files on the land as abandoned property. He pushed the knife back toward her. Keep it. You might need it. What do I do? She asked. 2 things, Silas said, and his voice carried the weight of a man who had watched this particular drama play out before. First, don't leave your land for any longer than you have to. He's waiting for you to run. Second, get witnesses. People who've been inside, who've seen what you've built. The more people who can testify you've improved that land, the harder it is for him to claim it's abandoned. Virgil Peck returned 2 weeks later, and this time he did not bother with pleasantries. He rode up to the base of the hill in full daylight, dismounted, and began driving wooden stakes into the ground in a rough perimeter around the dugout entrance. Claim stakes. Each one was a declaration, a statement of intent written in sharpened pine. Cora walked out to meet him. What are you doing? He looked up from his work, the hammer still in his hand, and smiled the way a man smiles when he believes the outcome is already decided. Public land, far as I can tell, no deed on file, no survey markers, just a hole in the ground and a woman who wandered in. He drove another stake. I've got as much right to claim this as anyone, more maybe, being as I'm a man and the law tends to see things my way. Cora stood very still. The anger was there hot and immediate, but she held it down the way she held everything down with the pressure of will and the knowledge that losing control now would cost her more than anything Virgil could take. This land is mine, she said. I've worked it, I've built on it, and I have witnesses. Witnesses. Virgil repeated the word as if tasting something amusing. We'll see what Judge Moss thinks about witnesses. That night, Cora woke to a sound that brought her upright in the dark, her heart slamming against her ribs. Footsteps in the dugout, not outside, inside. And the low, nervous lowing of Daisy, the sound the cow made when a stranger's hands were on her. Cora seized the axe from beside her bed and moved through the darkness on bare feet, silent, her body pressed against the cool earth wall. The main chamber opened before her, faintly illuminated by the starlight filtering through the entrance. And there was Virgil Peck, one hand on Daisy's halter, trying to lead the cow up the ramp and out into the night. He heard her before he saw her. He turned, and in the pale light, his expression was not surprise, but calculation, a rapid assessment of risk and reward. Cora stepped into the center of the chamber, the axe held across her chest, the blade catching a sliver of starlight. Step away from my cow. Virgil's eyes went to the axe, then to her face, then back to the axe. He released the halter. You're making a mistake, he said, his voice low and conversational, as if they were discussing the weather. A woman alone out here, no neighbors, no law within 10 miles. Things can go badly for people in your situation. Things can go badly for people in any situation, Cora said. Step away or step through me. Choose. The silence stretched between them like a wire pulled taut. The cow shifted uneasy. Somewhere outside, an owl called across the empty prairie. Virgil stepped back. He moved toward the entrance, slowly keeping his eyes on the axe. At the foot of the ramp, he turned. I'll be filing with Judge Moss. This isn't finished. Then he was gone, swallowed by the darkness, and Cora stood in her dugout with the axe still raised and her arms trembling, not from fear, but from the massive release of adrenaline that comes after a danger has passed, but before the body is willing to believe it. She did not sleep the rest of that night. The news traveled fast. Within a week, every person in Prospect Creek knew that Virgil Peck had filed a claim dispute with Judge Moss, that he was asserting rights to the hill, and that the hearing was set for Monday. Most of the men in town received this information with indifference. A land dispute between a drifter and a widow was not their problem. They had their own fences to mend. But Nettie Sutter came. She arrived at the dugout on a Sunday afternoon alone, breathing hard from the walk, her face flushed with exertion, and something else, a nervous electric energy that Cora had never seen in her before. Nettie had the look of a woman who had done something she was not supposed to do and was not yet sure whether she felt terrified or liberated. My husband doesn't know I'm here, she said immediately. Or if he does, he's choosing not to know. Those two things are different, but the result is the same. She sat on the stone bench Cora had built near the entrance and caught her breath. Then she said, I read the Homestead Act, not the version the men quote in the saloon, the actual law. I have found a copy at the church. She looked at Cora with an intensity that bordered on fierceness. If you can prove continuous improvement, and if you have witnesses to the work you've done, no one can take this claim from you. Not Virgil Peck, not Judge Moss, not anyone. The law is clear on this point, Cora. Clear. Cora stared at her. Why are you helping me? Nettie was quiet for a long time. She looked out at the prairie, at the vast, indifferent expanse of grass and sky, and when she spoke, her voice was very small, but there was steel in it. Because if you lose, then none of us has any hope at all. The hearing took place in the back room of the saloon in Prospect Creek, the only space in town large enough to hold more than 6 people in a table. Judge Leland Hossa, 55 years old, with small, shrewd eyes set in a square, impassive face, sat behind a plank desk with the grave authority of a man who understood that in this territory, his word was the closest thing to divine law that most people would ever encounter. Virgil Peck sat to the right, clean-shaven for the occasion. His posture relaxed, his expression carrying the easy confidence of a man who had done this before. Garrett Whitfield stood behind him, arms crossed there, to testify that Cora had left her original claim voluntarily and had no legal standing to file a new one. Cora stood on the other side of the room. She had no lawyer. She had no surveyor's report, no formal deed, no documentation of any kind beyond a handful of purchase receipts from Silas's store. The case as Virgil presented it was simple. The land was public, unregistered, unimproved by any legal definition. The occupant was a single woman with no formal education, no financial resources, and no male relative willing to vouch for her competence. He, Virgil Peck, was a capable, experienced frontiersman prepared to develop the property according to the provisions of territorial law. Garrett spoke next, his voice steady and measured. He confirmed that Cora had left the Whitfield homestead of her own accord. He made no mention of the letter from Judge Moss that had forced her out. He described her departure as the decision of a disturbed young woman unable to cope with the demands of frontier life. Cora listened to this, her face absolutely still. She did not interrupt. She did not protest. She waited. When it was her turn to speak, she said only, "I have witnesses." The door at the back of the room opened, and Silas Crail walked in. He carried his ledger, the thick cloth-bound book in which he recorded every transaction conducted in his store, and he placed it on Judge Moss's desk with the quiet authority of a man presenting evidence in a cathedral. He opened the ledger to the first marked page. October 14th, 1883, 1 spade, 1 axe head, paid in cash. He turned the page. November 2nd, rope canvas, tallow candles. Another page. December 28th, salt 50 pounds, muslin cloth. He continued month by month, a meticulous record of continuous purchase, continuous labor, continuous improvement. Each entry was dated, priced, and signed with Cora's mark. Then Harlan Briggs stood up. The room went quiet in a different way. Briggs was not a man who involved himself in other people's disputes. He was the largest landowner in the district, and his opinion carried a weight that had nothing to do with law and everything to do with the economics of respect. "I've been inside that dugout," he said, his voice filling the small room without effort. "It's the best built structure within 10 miles of this town. Dry, clean. Temperature holds steady winter and summer. I've seen barns built by men with 10 times her resources that aren't half as sound." He looked at Virgil Peck with an expression of undisguised contempt. "If what she's done to that hill is an improvement of the land, then I don't know what improvement is." Judge Moss sat in silence for a long time after Briggs finished speaking. His small eyes moved from Virgil to Garrett to Cora to the ledger open on his desk. The room held its breath. "I want to be clear about one matter," the judge said, his voice deliberate. "The letter I issued to Garrett Whitfield last October pertains solely to the transfer of the original Whitfield homestead claim filed under the name of the deceased Jesse Whitfield. That was a separate property, a separate matter. What we are discussing today is an entirely new claim on previously unregistered land. The two have no legal connection." He let the words settle over the room, and Cora saw Garrett's jaw tighten. "I will not rule today," the judge continued. The room stirred, murmured, shifted. "I will ride out to this property myself and conduct my own inspection. If what has been described here is accurate, I will issue a provisional claim certificate. If it is not," he looked at Cora and his expression gave nothing away, "then we will revisit the matter. You have 1 week." Judge Moss came on a Thursday. He arrived alone, dismounted, and walked into the dugout without speaking. He stayed for 30 minutes. He touched the walls. He examined the ceiling. He stood in the coal cellar and held his hand in front of his face, feeling the temperature on his skin. He walked the drainage channel. He inspected the stone floor. When he emerged, he said nothing. He mounted his horse and rode back toward town without a word. 2 days later, a sealed envelope arrived at Silas's store with Cora's name on it. Inside was a provisional claim certificate signed and stamped granting Cora Whitfield rights to 160 acres, including the hill. Virgil Peck was not seen in the territory again. The autumn that followed the hearing was the most peaceful season Cora had known since Jesse's death. The land was hers at least provisionally, and the fear of losing it, which had been a constant pressure at the base of her skull for months, began to ease. She expanded her herd, buying a second calf from the Carsons, and her cheese production doubled with the additional milk. Silas could not keep her butter on his shelves. It was late September when the surveyor arrived. His name was Dawson Mercer, and he came with a leather satchel full of instruments and notebooks, working for the railroad mapping terrain for a potential spur line. He was 27, tall and lean, with the sun-darkened skin of a man who spent his days outdoors and the precise, focused energy of a man who spent his evenings thinking about what he had observed. He was not interested in her butter or her cheese. He was interested in the hill. The geology of this formation is unusual for the region, he said, standing at the entrance, running his hand along the exposed face of the cut. He spoke with a specificity that startled her. He had names for the soil she had been digging, scientific terms that turned her intuitive understanding into something formal and documented. He asked if he could take measurements, and she nodded, curious despite herself. He spent an hour inside, tapping walls, sketching cross-sections in his notebook, measuring the angle of the entrance ramp with a transit level. When he emerged, he looked at her with an expression she had never received from another human being. It was respect, but not the grudging, surprised respect of Harlan Briggs. It was the respect of recognition. He had seen the intelligence in her work, the engineering hidden inside the survival. "You understood the load-bearing properties of the central pillar," he said, pointing to his notes. "And the entrance ramp, the angle you chose, minimizes erosion from surface runoff. Did you study engineering?" "I studied keeping my cow from freezing to death," Cora said. He smiled. A real smile, sudden and unguarded, the kind of expression that reveals the person behind the profession. The best teacher. They talked for over an hour. It was a conversation unlike any Cora had experienced, a genuine exchange between equals. He saw the science in her survival, and in his questions, she found names for the instincts she had followed. He described the principles she had discovered through labor and necessity, and hearing them articulated, hearing that her choices had been not just adequate, but brilliant, produced a sensation she could not immediately identify. It took her until that evening, sitting alone in the dugout after he had ridden away, to recognize it. Pride. She had not felt it in a very long time. Dawson returned the next day, and the day after that. He would finish his surveying work and ride out to the hill, and they would spend the evening hours in conversation and collaboration. Two people who had discovered that their knowledge, when combined, produced something greater than either could achieve alone. He noticed the air inside was perfectly still, the flame of a match burning without the slightest flicker, and identified the problem it would become when winter returned with the animal sealed inside. He sketched a design in the dirt with a stick, two vertical shafts, one tall and one short, placed at opposite ends of the chamber. Warm air rises and exits through the tall shaft, pulling fresh air in through the short one. A continuous natural circulation requiring no mechanism, no fuel, no maintenance. They built it together. He helped with the heavy work of digging the vertical shafts. She guided him through the soil, reading the density and moisture of each layer, with the fluency of someone who knew this particular piece of earth the way a musician knows an instrument. They worked in a rhythm that needed no coordination, a wordless efficiency that surprised them both. He brought her books: geology, architecture, agriculture. She taught him the knowledge that no book contained: how to predict weather from the flight patterns of birds, how to read water and the behavior of plants, how to bank a fire so it lasted until morning. The exchange was equal. Neither was the teacher, neither was the student. The dugout changed. A bed frame built from scavenged lumber, raising her mattress off the stone floor. Shelves fitted into the curved walls. A small cook stove, its pipe vented through one of the new shafts, filling the cavern with the smell of baking bread. The space was no longer a testament to survival. It was becoming a home. One evening, they sat at the small wooden table he had built, Ursham, the lantern casting warm light on the packed earth walls. His surveying equipment was neatly stored in one corner. His book stood on the shelf next to hers. He had been staying for weeks, sleeping on a cot near the entrance, their proximity both natural and unspoken. He looked at her across the table. "I have a question, Cora," he said. "Do you think there's room on that shelf for my geological survey maps?" It was not a grand declaration, not a formal proposal. It was a question about building a life together, asked in the only language they both understood, the practical, hopeful language of making a home. "I think," she said, a slow smile spreading across her face, "we can make room." But the following morning, a rider from the railroad office arrived with a letter. Cora watched from the entrance as Dawson read it, and she watched his face change. Not dramatically, a tightening around the eyes, a stillness in the jaw. The company was transferring him to Wyoming, a new survey route, a significant promotion, double the salary. He was expected within 2 weeks. The contract was for 6 months, possibly a year. He told her that evening, the letter open on the table between them, the lantern flame casting their two shadows on the wall in a single merged shape. "How long?" she asked. "6 months, maybe a year. Winter comes in 6 weeks." "I know." Neither of them said what needed to be said. Neither asked the other to choose. The silence was its own language, dense with everything that could not be spoken, because speaking it would make it real. What Dawson did not tell her, what he would not tell her until much later, was the real reason he was going. The railroad company had access to federal land records. If he could get to the territorial office in Wyoming, he could use his position to expedite a permanent land patent for Cora's claim. The provisional certificate from Judge Moss was a piece of paper that could be challenged, revoked, overturned by any future judge with a different opinion. A federal patent was permanent. It was the difference between permission and ownership. He left on a morning that smelled like frost. He placed his notebook of technical drawings on the table, every measurement of the dugout, every sketch of the ventilation system, every improvement he had imagined but not yet built. "Keep this," he said, "in case I'm late getting back." Cora took the notebook. She held it against her chest. "Don't be late." He mounted his horse and rode east toward the rail line. Cora stood at the entrance of the dugout and watched until his silhouette dissolved into the flat line where earth met sky. Then she turned and went back inside. She had survived alone before. She would do it again. But as she descended the ramp into the cool, quiet chamber that she had carved from nothing with her own hands, she noticed something through the entrance behind her. The sky to the north had changed. The blue was bleeding out of it, replaced by a color she had learned to fear, a heavy leaden gray that sat on the horizon like a lid being lowered over the world. And beneath that gray, a silence. No wind, no bird song, no movement of any kind. The kind of silence that comes before the earth holds its breath. Cora spent the first week of Dawson's absence reorganizing the dugout, as if order could substitute for company. She moved the cot he had slept in into the livestock chamber, stripped it of its blanket, and folded the blanket into a square that she placed on the shelf next to his books. She did not remove the books. She did not touch his surveying corner. These objects remained where he had left them, occupying space the way a held breath occupies the lungs present in waiting for release. Nettie Sutter arrived on a Wednesday in mid-October, hauling a canvas sack over one shoulder and leading a mule she had borrowed from a neighbor without asking. She was breathing hard and sweating despite the chill, and there was a brightness in her eyes that Cora had come to recognize as the particular glow of a woman doing something forbidden. 10 pounds of salt, Nettie announced, dropping the sack inside the entrance, and a laying hen. She produced the bird from a crate strapped to the mule, a russet-colored thing with skeptical eyes and an air of supreme indifference to her surroundings. "She's not pretty, but she produces, like some women I know." Cora took the hen. "Your husband doesn't know I'm here, or knows and is pretending he doesn't. His hand still hasn't healed right from last winter. He's learning that a wife with her own judgment isn't the worst thing that can happen to a man." Nettie brushed dirt from her skirt. "Show me what needs doing." They worked together for 3 days, salting meat, pressing cheese, banking straw against the interior walls for additional insulation. Their conversation was not about men or loss or the particular cruelties of life on the prairie. It was about technique, the precise ratio of salt to meat for a cure that would last 4 months. The way to read the direction of a coming storm by the movement of birds at dusk. How to know when cheese had aged enough by the sound it made when you tapped it with a knuckle. It was the conversation of two craftswomen, and in its simple, practical warmth, Cora found a companionship she had not known she was missing. On the third evening, as Nettie prepared to leave, she stood at the entrance and looked back into the dugout with an expression that Cora could not immediately read. It was not admiration exactly, it was something closer to hunger. "You built this," Nettie said quietly. "All of this, from nothing, with your own hands." "I had help," Cora said. "Silas, Dawson." Nettie shook her head. "They helped. You built." She paused. "I'm going to file my own claim next spring. 40 acres west of the creek. My husband can come along, or he can watch." Then she was gone, the mule clopping away down the frost-hardened track, and Cora stood in the entrance feeling something settle into place, a quiet understanding that what she had built was larger than a shelter, larger than a barn, or a cold cellar, or a home. It was proof. Proof that a thing could be made from nothing, that the world could be argued with and sometimes persuaded. The sky that had been threatening since Dawson's departure made good on his promise in the first week of December. The winter of 1885 arrived not as a season, but as a siege. The first blizzard was ferocious 3 days of horizontal snow and wind that screamed across the open prairie like something being tortured, but it was the cold that followed that became the stuff of legend. The kind of cold that people would speak of for decades, measuring all subsequent winters against it and finding them wanting. For 3 straight weeks, the temperature did not climb above zero. For 7 consecutive days within that stretch, it sank to 22 degrees below. On one particular night, the mercury in the thermometer at Silas Crail's store contracted into its bulb and refused to move the liquid itself, surrendering to a cold so profound that even the instruments designed to measure it could not function. The prairie became a foreign country. The ground froze to a depth of 4 feet, turning the earth into something closer to iron than soil. Fence posts cracked and split. Water in wells froze solid. The air itself seemed to harden each breath, a negotiation between the lungs in an atmosphere that had become hostile to the basic mechanics of being alive. In the wooden barns and sod houses of Prospect Creek and the surrounding homesteads, a catastrophe unfolded with the slow grinding inevitability of a glacier. Livestock began to die. Not in dramatic visible ways, not in the thrashing panic of an animal caught in a storm, but quietly standing in their stalls, their body heat leaching away through walls that offered no meaningful resistance to a cold this deep and this patient. The Carsons lost half their remaining herd in the first week. Old Fitzwilliam, who had rebuilt his chicken coop after last winter's losses, woke on the 8th morning to find every bird motionless on its perch, frozen in place, as if a taxidermist had arranged them. Harlan Briggs, the man who had built the largest cattle operation in the district, through 30 years of relentless work, walked into his barn on the 4th day and found 15 of his breeding stock dead where they stood, their legs locked, their eyes open, frost crystallizing on their lashes. He was 45 years old and had not cried since he was a boy, but that morning, surrounded by the still, cold bodies of animals he had raised from calves, his knees buckled and he wept. Panic settled over the community. Not the sharp electric panic of a sudden emergency, but the thick, suffocating kind that comes from watching a disaster you cannot stop. Every day brought new losses. Every morning another rancher rode into town with the same ashen face and the same grim arithmetic. 4 more. 7 more. 12. The numbers accumulated like snow, each one adding weight to a burden that was becoming unbearable. And then someone remembered. The words traveled from mouth to mouth through the frozen settlement, carried by men with scarves wrapped over their faces and desperation burning behind their eyes. "Remember that dugout, the one we laughed at? the woman in the hill. On the fourth day of the deep freeze, a group of men appeared at the entrance to Cora's shelter. There were 6 of them hunched against the cold, their horses steaming in the brutal air. They had ridden hard, and they looked at hollow-eyed, wind-burned, scared. At the front of the group, his hat pulled low, his usual posture of authority collapsed into something smaller and more desperate, stood Garrett Whitfield. He had aged, not gradually the way time ages a man, but suddenly the way catastrophe does. His cheeks were sunken, his eyes ringed with dark circles, and the rigid certainty that had once defined him, the hard, angular confidence of a man who always knew what was right, because right was whatever he decided it was, had crumbled. In its place was something Cora had never seen on his face before. Need. He stood at the entrance and looked past her into the interior. What he saw there stopped him. Daisy stood in her stall, chewing her cud with the contented rhythm of a healthy animal. The bull was beside her, heavy and calm. 2 calves lay in the straw, their flanks rising and falling in the slow cadence of deep sleep. The air was warm, steady and enveloping. The candle flame on the small table burned without flickering, and a faint circulation carried the smell of clean straw and warm milk and dry earth through the chambers. Garrett stared at the healthy animals at the shelves lined with cheese wheels and jars of preserved food. And then he looked at Cora, and what crossed his face was not just desperation. It was the anguish of a man confronted with the full scope of his own error, seeing for the first time the thing he had dismissed, the person he had discarded, and understanding with a terrible total clarity exactly what he had done. Cora, his voice cracked on the second syllable. We are losing everything. Our cattle are dying. Can you? He stopped. The words were physically difficult for him, each one extracted like a tooth. Can you help us? Cora looked at the man who had taken her home, who had forged papers with Judge Moss's seal, who had told her that the wolves would have her cows by spring, who had stood in a makeshift courtroom and lied calmly and without hesitation about the circumstances of her departure. She looked at him for a long time. She did not search his face for traces of Jesse. She did not need to find her dead husband's likeness in his brother's features in order to know what to do. She had decided what kind of person she was a long time ago, in a shallow scrape of dirt on a frozen hillside with a cow's heartbeat against her spine, and a choice that was not about courage but about milking in the morning. Bring the breeding stock, she said, her voice steady. The most valuable animals. We can make room. What followed was an operation of extraordinary precision conducted in conditions that should have made precision impossible. Under Cora's direction, the ranchers of Prospect Creek led their prize animals to the hill, guiding them through snow that reached the animals' chests, coaxing frightened, weakened cattle along a route marked by stakes that Cora had driven into the ground to prevent them from wandering off the path and into the drifts. At the entrance, she showed them how to lead each animal down the ramp, which she had covered with straw and scored with shallow grooves to prevent hooves from slipping. Inside, she organized the space with the efficiency of someone who understood every square foot of the chamber, packing the animals closely but safely positioning the largest cattle along the walls where the earth was thickest, keeping the calves in the center where the combined body heat was most concentrated. Nettie Sutter arrived at dusk. She had walked 3 miles through waist-deep snow with her 2 breeding cows alone because her husband's injured hand could not grip a lead rope in the cold. She came through the entrance, half frozen, her lips blue, her legs giving out beneath her on the ramp. Cora caught her before she fell, guided her to the stove, wrapped a blanket around her shoulders, and pressed a tin cup of hot tea into her shaking hands. They sat together in the warm dimness, surrounded by the sounds of 40 animals settling into unfamiliar quarters, the rustle of straw, the low murmur of breath, the occasional stamp of a hoof on the stone floor. Nettie held the cup in both hands and stared at the wall. I walked here, she said as if realizing it for the first time. 3 miles, alone, in this. She looked at Cora. I don't think I've ever done anything alone in my life. You have now, Cora said. That night, with more than 40 of the county's most valuable livestock packed into the chambers of the dugout, the temperature inside held firm. Every component Cora had built, every improvement Dawson had designed, every stone she had hauled, and every inch of earth she had carved functioned together as a single integrated whole. The hill did not just shelter the animals, it sustained them. Sometime after midnight, a commotion in the back chamber. One of Harlan Briggs's cows, a heavy, valuable Hereford that had been showing signs of distress all evening, went into labor. Cora was there within moments, kneeling in the straw, her hands steady, her voice low and calm. The birth was difficult, the calf turned wrong, and for 20 minutes Cora worked in the dim light of a single lantern, repositioning, coaxing, waiting for the contractions, her arms slicked to the elbows. The calf came, a bull calf, small but breathing, its wet body steaming in the warm air. Cora cleared its nostrils and laid it against its mother's side, and the cow began to lick it, with the fierce, instinctive tenderness of an animal that understands nothing about the world, except that this new fragile thing is hers and must be kept alive. The first cry the calf made was thin, wavering, uncertain. It echoed off the earthen walls and through the crowded chambers, and every person in the dugout heard it. Ranchers who had been dozing against the walls opened their eyes. Men who had spent the last week watching their animals die lifted their heads. Harlan Briggs, who had come in late and taken a position near the entrance, his face rigid with the effort of containing his grief, heard that small, trembling sound and pressed his hand over his mouth. A new life. Born underground in the dark, in the middle of the worst winter anyone alive could remember, in a shelter that had been built by a woman they had mocked, using principles they had not understood on land they had tried to take from her. Nobody spoke. The calf cried again, stronger this time, and its mother answered with a low rumbling sound that was older than language, older than civilization, older than the ice that had deposited the very soil surrounding them. And in the silence that followed, something shifted in that room. Not dramatically, not with speeches or apologies or grand gestures. Something quieter. Something that settled into the bones of every person present the way warmth settles into cold hands, slowly, painfully, and with a gratitude that cannot be adequately expressed. Late that night, when most of the men had fallen asleep among the cattle, Garrett found Cora in the far corner of the main chamber. She was adjusting the blanket around the newborn calf, tucking it tighter against the draft from the entrance. He stood before her, his hat in his hands, his head bowed. "We were wrong about you, Cora," he said. His voice was barely audible over the breathing of 40 animals. "We laughed. God forgive us. We laughed while you were building this." Cora did not look up immediately. She finished tucking the blanket. She ran her hand along the calf's spine, feeling the knobs of its vertebrae beneath the thin, damp skin. Then she spoke, still looking at the animal, not at the man. "You didn't just laugh, Garrett. You took my home. You put your name on papers that should have had mine. You stood in front of Judge Moss and said, 'I left by choice.'" She paused. "You know I didn't leave by choice." The silence between them was dense and heavy and full of years. Garrett did not defend himself. He did not explain or rationalize or offer the kind of qualified apology that protects the apologizer from the full weight of their wrongdoing. He simply stood there, his hat turning slowly in his hands, accepting it. "But you are Jesse's brother," Cora said, "and Jesse would not have wanted me to carry this through another winter." She looked up at him then. Her face was calm, not forgiving in the easy theatrical way that stories like to portray forgiveness with tears and embraces and the convenient erasure of harm. This was something harder and more honest. It was the decision to set down a burden, not because the person who placed it there deserved relief, but because the person carrying it could no longer afford the weight. "Your animals are safe," she said. "That's my answer." Garrett nodded. He turned away. His shoulders moved once a single involuntary tremor, but in the dim light no one could say for certain whether it was a shiver from the cold or something else entirely. The deep freeze broke on the 22nd day. The temperature climbed above zero for the first time in 3 weeks, and though it was still bitterly cold by any normal measure, the change felt tropical, a sudden loosening of the air that made people lift their faces to the sky and breathe without pain. Over the following days, the ranchers came to retrieve their animals. They led them up the ramp and out into a world that was white and blinding and still frozen but no longer lethal. Every animal that had entered the dugout walked out alive, every single one, including a small bull calf that blinked in the harsh daylight and pressed close to his mother's flank, taking his first uncertain steps on the surface of a world he had never seen. 3 weeks after the freeze broke on a morning that smelled of melting snow, and the first faint suggestion of distant spring, Cora was repairing a section of the entrance ramp when she saw a figure on the horizon. A single rider coming from the east, moving at the unhurried pace of someone who knows exactly where he is going and is in no rush to get there because the destination is permanent. She recognized the posture before she recognized the man. The straight back, the slight forward lean, the way he held the reins loosely in one hand. Dawson Mercer rode up to the base of the hill, dismounted, and stood looking at her. He was thinner. His face was darker from the Wyoming sun, and there were new lines around his eyes that spoke of hard weather and long distances. He carried a saddlebag over one shoulder, and in his free hand, he held a large envelope sealed with wax. He did not speak immediately. He looked at the dugout at the entrance that was wider and more reinforced than when he had left at the tracks in the snow from dozens of animals at the straw scattered across the ramp. Evidence of an event he had not witnessed but could read in the landscape the way he read geology in stone. "I heard what happened," he said. "At the rail station in Cheyenne, a man from Prospect Creek was there buying supplies. He told me the whole story." He paused. He called it a miracle. "It wasn't a miracle," Cora said. "It was a barn." He smiled. Then he held out the envelope. Cora took it, broke the seal, and unfolded the document inside. It was a land patent issued by the General Land Office of the United States, bearing the official seal of the federal government. It granted Cora Whitfield permanent irrevocable title to 160 acres of land in the territory of Nebraska, including the geological formation locally known as the Hill. She read it twice. Her hands were steady, her eyes were not. "The provisional claim was just a piece of paper," Dawson said. "Any new judge could have overturned it. This is different. This is federal. This is permanent. I used every connection I had at the railroad office to push it through." He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a second document, a letter on company letterhead addressed to his supervisor, a formal refusal of the promotion to Senior Surveyor, Wyoming Territory. Why, Cora asked, though she already knew. "Because Wyoming doesn't have a shelf where I want to put my maps." She looked at him. He looked at her. Between them, the air from the dugout exhaled its slow, cool breath, carrying with it the scent of earth and straw, and the accumulated warmth of everything that had happened inside those walls over the past 2 years. Then she reached out and took his hand, and they stood there at the entrance to the hill, not speaking, the patent in one hand and his fingers in the other, and the prairie stretching out around them in every direction, white and vast and no longer empty. They married in the spring. Silas Crail served as witness, standing in the Prospect Creek Church in his best coat, his ledger tucked under one arm out of habit. Nettie Sutter brought wildflowers. Harlan Briggs did not attend the ceremony, but that evening a wagon appeared at the base of the hill carrying 400 pounds of fresh cut lumber and a note in Briggs's angular handwriting that read simply, "For the roof." The years that followed, the Great Freeze became the foundation of a different kind of story. The dugout expanded. Cora and Dawson reinforced the original chambers with stone and timber, added new rooms, improved the drainage, and extended the cold cellar into a proper aging cave where cheese wheels sat on stone shelves in the constant cool darkness, developing flavors that brought buyers from as far away as Omaha. The place became known to everyone in the territory as the Warren, and it was spoken of with a respect that bordered on reverence. They raised 3 children in that underground home, 2 girls and a boy, children who grew up with dirt walls and stone floors, and the understanding that home was not a structure placed upon the land, but a space carved within it. The oldest girl, Winnie, became the first teacher in Prospect Creek, and she taught her classes in a room excavated from the hillside next to the Warren, cool in summer and warm in winter. Her students called it the Cave School, And years later, old men and women who had learned their letters in that earthen classroom would remember the particular quality of its silence, the way sound was absorbed by the walls, creating a stillness that made concentration feel natural, effortless, like the room itself was paying attention alongside them. When someone once asked Winnie about her mother, she thought for a moment and said, "My mother didn't build a house. She asked the hill what it wanted to become." It was the kind of answer that sounds simple until you think about it, and then it sounds like everything. Silas Crail retired from his store in the spring of 1892. Before he closed the doors for the last time, he rode out to the Warren with a package wrapped in brown paper. Inside was his ledger, the cloth-bound book that had sat on his counter for over a decade, recording every transaction in the territory, including the meticulous trail of receipts that had saved Cora's claim in the hearing that now felt like a lifetime ago. "Keep it," he said, placing it on the shelf next to Dawson's geology text and Cora's worn copies of the agricultural manuals she had long since surpassed. "So you remember that sometimes the best evidence isn't a legal document. Sometimes it's a receipt for dried beans." Cora took the ledger. She held it for a moment, feeling its weight, the soft grain of the cloth binding the slight warp of pages that had absorbed 10 years of pencil marks and spilled coffee and the oils of 1,000 hands, exchanging goods across a wooden counter. Then she did something she had never done before in all the years she had known him. She put her arms around the old man and held him. Silas stood stiffly for a moment, surprised, his arms at his sides. Then he raised one hand and patted her shoulder twice with the awkward gentleness of a man who has spent his life expressing affection through fair prices and quiet acts of faith. It was the only time they ever embraced, and it was enough. Silas passed away 2 winters later, quietly in his sleep, in the small room behind the store that someone else now ran. They buried him on the hill east of town where the wind blows steady and the grass never quite lies flat. Cora placed a small round of her best aged cheese on the grave before they filled it in. It was not a gesture anyone else understood, but it did not need to be. It was a final transaction between two people who had always communicated best through the exchange of practical things. Nettie Sutter filed her own homestead claim the following spring, 40 acres west of the creek, just as she had promised. Her husband came along not because he approved, but because he had spent a winter watching his wife walk 3 miles through a blizzard to save his cattle, while he sat by the fire with a hand that wouldn't close, and that experience had rearranged something fundamental in his understanding of the world. He never became an enthusiastic supporter, but he stopped objecting, and on the prairie in those years, silence from a husband was as close to permission as most women ever received. Nettie's claim prospered. She grew wheat and kept chickens and built a small but sturdy sod house that she designed herself, incorporating a half basement dug into the slope of the land, a modest echo of the Warrens' principle that shelter should work with the earth rather than simply sit upon it. On Saturday mornings, she and Cora would sit together on the stone bench at the Warrens' entrance, drinking coffee and watching the prairie wake up 2 women who had found their way to a friendship built not on shared suffering, but on shared capability. They rarely spoke about the past. They talked about soil and weather and the price of seed corn and whether Nettie's youngest was ever going to learn to milk a cow without getting kicked. It was the ordinary conversation of ordinary neighbors, and that ordinariness was itself a kind of miracle, a destination that neither of them 5 years earlier could have imagined reaching. Harlan Briggs never apologized. He was not a man built for apologies, and Cora never expected one. But every October, without fail, a wagon loaded with winter straw appeared at the Warren. No driver, no note, no invoice. It simply materialized at the base of the hill as if the prairie itself had delivered it. And every week, without fail, Briggs rode the 4 miles from his ranch to buy a wheel of Cora's aged cheese, paying whatever she asked without discussion, eating it at his kitchen table with the focused, appreciative attention of a man who understands that some debts cannot be repaid, but can be honored week by week, purchase by purchase for the rest of a life. Garrett Whitfield never came to the Warren again after the night of the Great Freeze. He and Delia remained on the old Whitfield homestead, raising cattle, living the careful, constricted life of people held together by obligation rather than affection. Cora heard through Silas and later through his successor at the store that Delia had begun speaking more, making decisions about the household, asserting herself in small ways that accumulated over time into something approaching autonomy. Whether the change was inspired by Cora's example or by the simple erosion of Garrett's authority after his public humiliation, no one could say. Perhaps it was both. Perhaps one made the other possible. In the spring of 1910, a young man arrived at the Warren from the State University. His name was Professor Aldrich, and he was collecting oral histories and documenting the architectural adaptations of the early settlers. He had heard the story of the woman who saved a town's herd by hiding it underground, and he had come to see if the legend matched the reality. He spent a week with Cora and Dawson, who were now in their late 40s, their faces carrying the deep, particular lines that come not from age alone, but from decades of wind and work and the slow accumulation of a life built by hand. He measured temperature gradients between the chambers with instruments far more precise than the old thermometer Cora had bought from Silas 25 years before. He sketched the ventilation shafts, marveling at their elegant simplicity. He filled 3 notebooks with Cora's recollections, recording them in a precise academic hand that transformed her plain-spoken memories into historical record. On his last afternoon, they sat near the entrance Aldrich on a wooden chair, Cora on the stone bench she had built so long ago that the edges had been worn smooth by decades of sitting. Below them, the prairie rolled away to the horizon, green and gold, in the late spring light, and from the creek came the sound of children laughing. Winnie's children, Cora's grandchildren, running through the shallow water, catching minnows, their shrieks carrying on the warm breeze, with the particular clarity that sound achieves on the open plains, where there is nothing between the source and the listener but air and grass and time. People call it a miracle, Aldrich said, his pencil poised over a fresh page. Cora watched the children. A girl of about 7 had caught something in the water and was holding it up triumphantly, the sunlight flashing off the wet silver of a tiny fish. It wasn't a miracle, she said. The ground was cold in the summer and warm in the winter. The hill told me what it was for. All I did was listen. Aldrich asked for a photograph. Cora and Dawson stood before the entrance to the Warrens side by side, not touching, not smiling, looking directly into the camera, with a shared expression that Aldrich would later describe in his published monograph as the calm endurance of people who have become indigenous to their landscape. They did not stand in front of the hill. They stood as part of it, as rooted and permanent as the ancient earth behind them. The photographer took a second exposure, a candid shot that Aldrich had not requested. It was taken later in the day as the sun was getting low, and it showed Cora alone. She was sitting in her chair at the entrance, her work finished, her family scattered across the property in the various occupations of a late spring afternoon. The light was golden, falling across the prairie at the low angle that turns ordinary grass into something luminous. And from the dark arched opening of the Warren behind her, a gentle current of cool air moved outward into the warm evening, carrying with it the scent of deep earth and cured hay and stone that has been shaped by human hands. It is this second photograph that survives. Not the formal portrait with its stiff postures and historical significance, but the candid one. The one that shows an old woman sitting at the mouth of a hill on a warm evening, her hands resting in her lap, her face turned toward a horizon she had walked to once with nothing but 2 cows and a broken spade and $20, in the memory of a man who had told her that the ground here holds its shape. The land that had cast her out had become her partner, her collaborator, her most patient and generous provider. It had given back everything she had lost and more, not because she had conquered it or tamed it or bent it to her will, but because she had done the one thing that almost no one in that vast, harsh, beautiful country had thought to do. She had listened to it, and the hill in its slow and ancient way had answered.